I'm Joel Garrow. I'm a co-director of this initiative. Future Tense is a partnership among the New America Foundation, Slate Magazine, and Arizona State University. Our goal is to look at not just at emerging technologies, but to ask what do they mean for our culture, values, and society, and what it means to be human.
Did you know that Bakio is the on-campus restaurant?
هل كنت تعرف أن عاصمة أوزبكستان هي طشقان الجامعة؟
Hello, Hala.
Welcome to Carnegie Mellon University in Qatar. Feel free to talk with me in English or Arabic. What's your native language? How can I help you? English is an important language. I am a roboceptionist.
What do you do?
I'm a bilingual roboceptionist. I should be able to answer Carnegie Mellon related questions in Arabic and in English. Try me.
Which is how we end up with this question about our killer robots, job killer robots.
To get to 1004, you need to take the entrance to your left, then turn left again, walk straight and take the second corridor to your right. It should be one of the offices inside.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
How old are you?
A robo lady never reveals her true age. Let's just say I'm not the newest model on the block.
أنا بخير. استطيع التحدث بالعربية والإنجليزية.
Have a good day. And remember, the next time your computer doesn't work, don't hit it. We have feelings too.
Dr. Reed Simons, thank you so much for taking the time for this interview. And first, we'd like to know from you, how can we call a robot socially interactive, and how is it different from any other robot?
So, most robots, when they operate, they only take themselves into account, their own safety, their achievement of their own goals, so how fast to get to a particular location, how easily it takes to do something. But in social interactions, you take other people into account as well. So you have to understand what they're trying to do and what you can do to help both of you do something smoothly. So like when you're getting onto an elevator, if you barge into the elevator, when people are trying to get out, you block the elevator and no one can move. So the people who are getting on wait till the people get off, and then they can get on. And by doing so, by understanding that there is someone else who is trying to achieve a goal, to try and do something, then you can get both people acting very smoothly, and they won't interfere with each other. So that's kind of the basis of social interaction. And socially interactive robots are robots that not only take their own goals into account, but also the goals of people around them.
So how does a social interactive robot really work?
So basically, the main difference is that what I said, that they have to understand what the people around them are trying to do and act accordingly. So one of the things I like to say is that most of us think that the social rule for getting on and off onto elevators is that you wait for everyone to get off the elevator before you get on. But that's actually not the correct rule. The correct rule is that you wait for everyone who intends to get off the elevator before you get on. Because some of the people aren't going to get off. They're just waiting to go to another floor. And so when we as people, and the elevator opens, when we as people decide whether we want to get on immediately or wait, we have to look at the people in the elevator and try and understand their intention, try and understand whether they want to get off or whether they want to stay. And that understanding of the other people's intention is what is critical for making socially interactive robots work. They have to not only know what they want to do themselves, but they have to perceive the people around them and try and understand what those people are trying to do. And people don't have signs on them that says, I'm getting off on floor 3, I'm getting off on floor 4. The robots have to look and try and understand cues, such as gaze. So when the elevator opens, people who aren't getting off tend to look down. People who are getting off tend to look up, want to make sure it's the right floor. Some of them, they start moving. You have to detect them moving forward versus just rocking back and forth. And those types of simple cues are things that are very difficult for robots to do. So we pick up those cues very, very quickly because we've been trained from birth to pick up these social cues. But robots have to be programmed to understand those cues, and it turns out to be a very difficult thing for them to understand what those cues are.
So what techniques is CMU doing to enable robots to act in a socially acceptable?
So we're looking at basically two different types of social interaction. One is what I call conversational interaction, which is basically what we're doing right now. So while I'm talking to you, you're looking at me, and you're nodding at me to indicate that you understand what I'm talking about. And if you were to start looking off over to the side there, I would know that I had lost you, and I need to say something in order to get you back into the conversation. So that's kind of conversational interaction. And Hala is an example of a conversationally social interactive robot. So it uses gaze to try and bring people in, to engage them. It watches them as they type on the keyboard, and it knows enough about how conversations run to respond appropriately. If someone says hello, the robot will say hello. If someone says salam, the robot will say salam. So it does the appropriate thing in the right context. The other aspect that we're looking at is what I call navigational interaction, and that is how robots can navigate through space in a socially interactive way. So the getting on and off elevators in a socially interactive way, passing in corridors. So when people are coming towards each other in a corridor, one person moves to the right, the other person moves to the right, and they pass without really having to think very hard about how to do that. And that's a social rule. In fact, it's not only a social rule, it's a cultural rule. So in places like England and Japan, where they drive on the left-hand side, they don't pass on the right, they pass on the left. And so if you were to go to England and not understand that, then you would start bumping into people. So you have to know what the social rule is in order to work well in the society.
Okay, so how do you see the international efforts in the area of social interactive robots, and where do you see Qatar fits in?
So when we started this work, we were focused on social interaction, and the idea was that there were these kind of universal social rules that people obeyed. And it turns out that that was simplistic, that it actually is not only social rules, but cultural rules as well. So the way that people interact in different parts of the world differ somewhat according to the culture. So a Middle Eastern culture has somewhat different social rules than a Western culture. And so what we're looking at in Qatar, especially with Hala, is to try and understand those cultural differences and be able to develop a system that can be social and culturally appropriate in Qatar, and at the same time, if you were to take it to the United States, it would be socially and culturally appropriate in the United States by changing a few variables, a few parameters. Right now what we're doing is just trying to explore the various ways that these robots can differ. But one example in navigational interaction is that there is this idea of personal space, how close people will come to one another when they're talking. And in different cultures, the personal space is larger or smaller. And we can characterize that. We can say, okay, if you're in Mediterranean culture, personal space is much smaller, and we can tell the robot this is the size of the personal space when you're in Italy, for example, versus the United States, where it's much larger. And then the robot can behave like an Italian or like an American.
So what do we mean when we speak about the gap between the robotic behavior and the social interaction? What do we mean by this gap?
So again, the basic gap is understanding other people. It's this idea that the robot is not operating in isolation, but it's operating in a peopled environment, and it has to understand not only what it is trying to do, but what the people around it are trying to do, and to behave in ways that facilitate not only its own actions, its own goals, but the goals that of the other people. So when people are typically when you talk about people being antisocial, you say, oh, he's very rude, he's very antisocial. What they typically mean is that this person only thinks about himself and doesn't think about anyone else. And that's the same thing for the robots. The robots, if they behave only thinking about themselves, then they tend to look antisocial. And when they start considering other people, then they look more social. So the main thing that we have to look at is how we can get them to understand that there are people around and what those people are interested in doing, whether they want to have a conversation with the robot, or be left alone, or be escorted somewhere, or that they have certain other needs. All those things need to be understood by the robot in order to be looked at as social.
So what future uses can socially interactive robots be used in?
So my personal philosophy is that social interaction can be applied anywhere that we have technology. So not just robots. So you might think of the robot receptionist is a very good example. Service robots. So a robot that is coming in to, let's say, clean floors. It needs to know that there are other people around there. Maybe it shouldn't come into this room because there are people working. It goes some other room first and then comes back to this room later so it doesn't disturb the people. Maybe when it comes in, it asks very politely, is it okay to clean the room here, rather than just barging in and cleaning the floors. But other technology as well. Think about all the things that we use these days that are electronic. cell phones, microwaves, DVRs, televisions, stereos. All of those have very unsocial interfaces. You know, they're buttons and knobs and things like that. They don't understand what people are trying to do. Think about a world in which, you know, your microwave knows how you like your tea to be heated in the morning, the temperature of the water. And when you come in, you don't have to press all these buttons. It just recognizes, you know, here's someone here with a teacup. I know that he likes it at, you know, this particular temperature, and you just put it in, and it says, oh, you know, good morning, nice to see you again. I'm going to heat your tea up like you like it. And you can say, no, I'd like it a little warmer today than usual. Okay, I'll do that for you. That's social interaction. You know, you can think that's how you would do it if you know, a couple living together. You know, you don't have to press buttons. You just talk to them, and they understand you, and they know what you like, and you know, those types of things can be, that type of social interaction can be used anywhere that we have technology. It would make interacting with our technology so much more useful.
So when we have a social interactive robot, how can we evaluate it and make sure that, how can we assess its effectiveness?
So we're very lucky in that respect, because psychologists have been doing experiments on humans, how humans interact for many, many years. And so there's a well understood methodology for understanding human-human interaction and measuring it and measuring its effectiveness. So basically we use the same technologies, we basically use the same techniques that the psychologists use in order to evaluate and measure. So we do a lot of user studies. We bring people into the lab and ask them to perform certain tasks with the robot, and then we look at how well they perform the tasks. We ask them to rate their experiences with the robots, and through that we understand which techniques work better, which techniques work worse. With Hala, it's a slightly different thing, because Hala's out there. We don't invite people in, but when people interact with Hala, all the interactions are recorded, and we can do experiments. So 1 week we can run Hala with a certain program, and the next week we run it with a slightly different program, and we can compare how people interact with them, how long they interact, whether they say thank you to Hala when she answers their questions, how frequently they do that, how frequently, you know, what types of questions they ask, and we can use that to try and understand whether changes that we make to Hala's behavior actually improves the interaction or worsens it. And based on that, we can go further in the research and develop other techniques.
So my final question, tell us about the lecture you gave about social interactive robot at CMU on April 19th, and how did you find the audience response?
I think it went rather well. It's always hard for me to judge how my own talks go, but there seemed to be a lot of interest in this idea of social robots. There was actually, what was interesting to me is there was a lot of discussion about why you would want to have a social robot. So one of the things that people might ask is, why would you want a robot that behaves like a human rather than a robot that behaves like a robot? You know, some people are afraid that if robots start behaving too much like humans, that it will lessen the difference between robots and humans. So there was a lot of discussion about that. I think, though, that in general, you do want robots to act more like humans, because we know how to interact with other humans. We don't know how to interact with robots right now. So if we have a robot that behaves differently than anything we've ever seen before, we have to learn how to interact with it. That takes a lot of effort. So you put a robot in, let's say, a facility where the elderly are, and have the robots, try and help the elderly get around. Older people, they're not going to want to learn how to interact with this very complex machine. They know how to interact with people. They know how to interact with the aides in the facility. You just want the robots to interact in the same way, so people don't have to learn new ways of interacting with this very complex technology.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reed Simons, for this interview, and wish you the best of luck. Thanks a lot. Thanks.
It's been a pleasure.
Human autonomy is the result of the seamless integration of our perception, our cognition, and our action. This autonomy is this integrated ability that enables humans to perform by themselves without the need to be teleoperated. Autonomous robots aim at this same capability, acting without being teleoperated. So they have sensors, like distance sensors, cameras. They use their computers to plan for their actions, and they move. So Cobot, this mobile robot at Carnegie Mellon, performs tasks for users in our building, picking up and delivering objects from location to location. Sensors provide a very large amount of complex numerical data, from temperature levels to distance to obstacles, walls, people, furniture, from which robots need to interpret features about the scene so they can plan for their tasks. For example, a robot needs to know their position. And for that, Cobot uses their 3D scene images to try to extract planar surfaces that are matched to walls and then to maps. And the more accurate is this mapping, the more confident the robot knows where it is. This is a robot that actually moves in our environment, performing tasks, going from location to location in very different environments in terms of their appearance, from corridors to halls, and even glass bridges with success. However, in spite of the significant advances in having robots move, robots have many cognitive perception limitations at the perception, cognition, and action level. And they definitely cannot understand all natural language and perform all actions such as going upstairs or opening doors. So at Carnegie Mellon, we actually introduced a new concept of autonomy for robots, this symbiotic autonomy, which enables robots to ask for help to overcome their limitations. So please press the elevator button. This says an armless cobot. Please put the envelope in my basket. And humans can help with these very simple requests. Cobot can also go to the web if their request involves something for which it misses knowledge. For example, bring me coffee. If Cobot does not know where coffee is in the building, it queries the web and then goes to the most probable place returned by the web where the object can be, in this case, kitchen for coffee. It also interacts with humans through dialogue and can ask for clarifications. And when it doesn't understand what the human says, it may pop up some kind of other representation, such as a map, where the humans can specify what they mean by conference room or what they mean by printer room. And all these interactions with the humans and the web are saved for future use by the robot. Finally, if the robot does not get its help, it waited and nobody pressed the button, it also automatically can fill email messages, templates with the situation, emails to the developers, and asks for some remote help to come to the place where the robot didn't get the help. We have been talking about a single robot, but after all, our research involves multiple robots, multiple cobots that coordinate to actually optimize their task and share knowledge. Such cobots have moved at Carnegie Mellon close to 1,000 kilometers in the last 2 years. Our multi-robot coordination is motivated and builds upon a lot of the work we do in robot soccer, in which robots beautifully plan for joint motion and teamwork that leads into this beautiful four-way path that ends with this successful goal. Our multiple robots at Carnegie Mellon, in addition to actually doing their pickup and delivery tasks, have introduced and have performed a very novel and new task of data collection. They move in the buildings with their sensors and knowing their location, and they can collect temperature, humidity, Wi-Fi signal strength data, and provide these maps for great policy making based on the data. So symbiotic autonomous robots, it's a reality. Multiple robots, multiple humans, the web, the physical space. So we can see these robots as cyber, physical, social systems, kind of a new species that coexists with humans. So the ultimate final question that we face is how to move these robots from our labs and our buildings to the real world is how do we actually envision interacting with and getting help from these fascinating new artificial kind of intelligent creatures.
I want to give a special bow to our partner Slate today. Especially like to ask Tori Bosch to stand up and take a bow. She's the editor of our new Future Tense channel, being launched on Slate in the coming weeks. That's a space to watch. On Slate this week, you're going to find a terrific series by Farhad called Will Robots Steal Your Jobs? I strongly recommend it to you. It's a terrific piece of work. Is Josh Levine here yet? No, I guess not. Will be here later, I guess, the executive editor of Slate and the editor of this series. Don't we have robots that can do that? No.
Well, he's not here. He's a robot.
The reason we're here today is that when robots came for the automobile assemblers, I was not an automobile assembler. But now they're coming after the doctors and the lawyers and the journalists. So these are the white-collar eating robots. And of course, by robots, we don't just mean Wall-E. We mean artificial intelligence writ large that is actually now arriving. And if this freaks you out too much, remember that we'll be having adult refreshments at the reception afterwards, so stick around. A few housekeeping thoughts here. Remember, this event is being webcast, so everything is on the record. If you choose to speak up, please wait for the microphone, and please introduce yourself, and please be concise. So now let me hand this over to the star of the show, a columnist for Slate who writes about the technology industry, new products, and social media. He is the author of True Enough, Learning to Live in a Post-Fact Society. Ladies and gentlemen, Farhad Manjoo.
Hi. Hi, thanks, and thank you all for coming. So I want to talk a little bit about the series. It's focused on this question that I've been thinking about for a while because many members of my family, my dad and my wife, my dad's a pharmacist, my wife's a doctor, she's a pathologist, and she spends her days looking at slides that have images that may contain cancer in them and may not. And this has always seemed to me like a problem that's not well suited for humans because it's sort of like TSA agents, right? They have to, you have to sort of be very focused and also spot something rare. It seems like a thing that a machine would be better at. And in fact, when I talked to my wife, many of her colleagues are kind of afraid of this. And this was the spark of the series, which is a look at robots and machines that will be replacing people who are paid a lot to do their work, but whose work is in some sense vulnerable to machines. And so the people on this panel, I think, speak to some of this, and we wanted them here because they each come at this from a different sort of standpoint. So Michael Schmidt, he is, as a graduate student at Cornell, he worked on a project called Eureka, which was a shorthand way of saying it is it's a robotic scientist. And what it does is it looks at data from the physical world and comes up with fundamental laws of science, of nature from that data. And he can talk more about it in a little bit. Now he's the president of Newtonian Inc., which is a business that's focused on expanding this graduate project into a business, and he can talk about that too. So Sarah Kramer is the next person. She is a doctor, a family practice doctor, and the reason I wanted her here is because I write about her in the series as someone who is actually not vulnerable to machines, and her job I think is one of the few jobs I found that, you know, maybe in 50 years or more, we'll see, she could be replaced by a machine, but before then I think it's going to be difficult, and we can talk about why. And then Robbie Allen is trying to get my job because he is the founder of Automated Insights, which is a company that writes automatically produces news stories from data. So their first application was to look at all of the stats from various sporting events, baseball, basketball, and you can look at all the stats in a game and come up with a pretty good story that is not written by humans. So I wanted to talk, I think I wanted to start with Robbie, because you have the most sort of impressive demo of, like, if we want to see whose jobs are vulnerable next, we would look to your technology. Tell us about how the robotic sports writer works, and then I wonder if you can talk about, you know, what it can do beyond writing sports.
Sure.
Stories.
And real quick, you compared your wife to a TSA agent. Does she know about that?
Yeah, I'm lucky she's not watching this website.
Yeah, so you know, conceptually, our technology is pretty straightforward. We take a large amount of data, which actually is not very easy to compile. We write algorithms and create a database of phrases that we then use to determine, based on a particular situation, in this case a sporting event, which of those phrases apply to that game. And then we do various replacements in the data that will include the stats, player names, venues, that type of thing. And then when you piece it all together, it's a fairly coherent 3 to 4 paragraphs worth of content describing the important events and things that occurred in a particular sporting event. So in order to make this happen, we needed sort of a combination of skill sets. I have a background in computer science, but I've also written several technical books. A couple of years ago, I had the thought that I wanted to create the next great sports blog network. For those that are familiar with SB Nation, which is a local startup that is probably the most popular collection of sports blogs, they have about 400 writers on staff that author all of their blogs. And I thought, well, I'd like to do something like that, but I wanted to automate it. And so that's kind of where this notion came along, that I thought if I could marry my expertise programming and writing, that if I had the data, I could just create technology that would automatically produce narratives.
Can I just, because that seems a peculiar thing. Why, you know, you wanted to create a sports blog. Why did you want to automate it? Like, who thinks of that?
Well, so Statsheet, when I originally started Statsheet in 2007, it was just me, before I raised any money. And so in order for me to scale, I had to automate everything that I could do. You know, I couldn't. It was
just sort of a manpower issue.
It was a manpower thing. There's no way I could have a 400 writer staff within a year or two. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, well, if I could automate it in some way, then that allows me to scale more quickly.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I found interesting is that you're doing a lot of work, you're creating a lot of sports stories that compete with what human writers are creating. But you're also creating sports stories that human writers could never do because they're focused on a team so small that you wouldn't be able to pay a human to do that work, and now a robot can. I think this is, and I found this in many different fields, it's a situation where the robots are giving us things that, they're benefiting society at large. There are some people who want to read about those sports who just, those teams who just can't because there's no human writing about them, and now we're getting that from robots. So do you think of it then, your technology is replacing humans, or do you think of your technology as supplementing humans?
So this is a question we get all the time, mostly from journalists. Which, when I
got to pay the rent.
when I started this, the initial sort of blog post I wrote about it on our company website automatically got like a half dozen reporters emailing me within 30 minutes wanting to know, are they going to be automated out of a job. I personally don't see it that way. I don't think that what we're doing is going to automate journalists out of a job, at least yet. So I think there's a couple things. One is we can have broader coverage than what a typical person can do, as Farhad mentioned. There's a lot of teams that just don't get adequate coverage in the sports space, and so we can do that very inexpensively. The other thing is, I will say, while it's potentially not right now that our content is as good as a human writer, it's getting better every day, and within the next 3 to 4 years, it will be better than what a human can produce. And the reason for that is pretty much the foundations of computations. We can analyze and access significantly more data than what one person could ever do on their own. So if you think about writing, it's a solitary event. One person sits down and writes about something. With our technology, we can incorporate multiple people's understanding and logic into our software, and then over time we can improve it in such a way that it can be improved at a greater rate than what one person can possibly improve on their own. And so we get to take advantage of all the benefits that you do in traditional software, but in writing words.
I found a similar thing in what you're doing, Michael, because, well, maybe you can start by talking about how Eureka works and then talk about Newtonian, because I think what you're trying to do with Newtonian is also allow people to get scientific insights in a place where they wouldn't normally be able to hire scientists to do it.
Sure. So I've spent the past 5 years or so working on this sort of robotic scientist project. And the goal has been to accelerate scientific discovery and make it easier to understand data and to figure out relationships and the meaning behind phenomena you might observe in the laboratory. And what we're able to do is design an algorithm that can look at a set of data. So it could look at, say, a swinging pendulum, and then just think about that data for a while, and then in the end it comes back and it says, aha, F equals ma. And this will tell you how all pendulums work and many, many related physics and things like this.
But explain how it does that.
So how does it do that? So this is a type of artificial intelligence where we're searching over a space of equations. So F equals ma is an equation. F equals m divided by a is an equation. There's actually an infinite number of possible equations, but only a few actually make sense. And the algorithm uses an evolutionary approach to compete multiple equations together so that the right equation emerges and filters out only the most meaningful expressions until it can narrow down onto the single fundamental salient property of the systems. So like F equals ma or E equals mc squared. And so we had a lot of success with this. We got a lot of press about it. People got very excited. So we released this software so people could do it at home. And the software is called Eureka. You can actually download it. It's completely free to try out. Just go to eureka.com. And you can throw your data in there. You can see what the hidden mathematical properties are in the data.
And then other scientists have used it, and you were telling me about, on all fields of science. So you did it on physics, first of all, on a set of physics equations, and we knew the equations you were looking for there. These are things that Newton found. But now people are using it to break new scientific ground.
Yeah, the really interesting thing is once people have things that they didn't already know about, they don't understand it, but they have the answer. We're kind of turning the tables on how science is going to be done, because you'll have solutions, you'll have answers, but not necessarily the accompanying explanation that goes along with them. So, like you said, a lot of people have tried this out and used it. Actually, you can go to Google Scholar and see it. There's around 50 papers now that have come out that have used results directly from the software. And it's really exciting to see. These are things where ordinarily people might struggle for years figuring out the math behind their data, or they might not be able to afford a PhD student to analyze their system or investigate their product or whatever you have. So we're trying to empower people to make them understand things more quickly and to cross the gap from being able to get the data and manage the data and understand the system to fill in the details. What is the fundamental physics behind the system?
Right.
And that's where the software comes in Newtonian.
Just one more question before I get to Sarah. So it sounds like many scientists have responded positively to this.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard people who, are worried about this kind of software replacing the humans in?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yes.
So after our paper came out in Science, I think in the end of 2009, and we got a lot of interesting emails and letters and phone calls from people that are very concerned about conspiracies and saying that
But
to
like,
stay out of it.
were they crazy people or were they real scientists?
See, I can't always tell.
Right.
So I'm not an expert in this.
Problem
but
with
What's the
email.
difference?
Yes.
yeah, one man's crazy, another man's genius, right? So so some people are surprised, but I think once people actually try it out and use it and see what it can actually do for them, they actually get quite excited about it.
And you think of it as a kind of a supplement to humans, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. So we're trying to make everyone into a Newton. We want to make everyone strong enough in their math and their physics to be able to make those leaps that ordinarily they just couldn't afford to do.
Right. So the interesting thing about what Robbie does and what Michael does is they both are fields that involve a lot of data. It's a lot of structured data that they can analyze and kind of get an answer. What Sarah does is interesting because she's a primary care doctor. People come to her every day with problems, and it seems like you could have a computer that would just, I could submit, it hurts, my leg hurts when I do this, and then it would give me an answer. Tell me why and in fact, there are diagnosis software out there, and IBM is trying to turn Watson into something like that. Tell me why we need you.
So, a little bit of context. I
Yes.
am actually, as we discussed before, I'm actually an end user of a lot of
Yeah.
data that is derived. I do use an electronic software. Certain elements of medical diagnosis have actually been automated for a long time, and the easiest one is the EKG. The EKGs have had automated algorithm-based interpretations for, I want to say, close to 20 years, and they work pretty well. And it hasn't put cardiology out of business, though. So to answer the question about why diagnosis is handy, and actually the faster you get the diagnosis, it's kind of like having, I would imagine having something analogous to, is it Michael?
Yes.
His software using, you'd be like having this, like a team of really super smart medical students kind of looking everything up in the journals and telling me what's going on, and that would be super handy. But in primary care, especially, so much of what we do is both contextual and also translational. Because in primary care, we say, the patient is the nurse. They have to walk out of there knowing what to do, how to manage it. I mean, you may come to me and you already know you've got an ankle sprain. I mean, the diagnosis is uncontroversial. It's a matter of what are your goals, what's your past history of ankle sprains, do you want to run in a marathon 6 weeks from now, what is your, what is going to be the plan around that? Or one of the stories I was sharing with Robbie outside in the hallway is I saw a young man recently. He came in and he had been having a cold for 2 days. The diagnosis was uncontroversial. If you plugged it into Watson, it would clearly be a viral cold. He was healthy as a horse, didn't smoke, doesn't have asthma. There was like nothing wrong with him. The context of his concern was that his girlfriend had just been diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, and he came in and said, I can't get her sick. What can you do to keep me from getting my girlfriend sick? Because she's going through, she's going to have her immune system wiped out and have a bone marrow transplant. So that's where, the diagnostic algorithms only get you so far, and then it's the context and then the translational piece, and what is the patient really there for? There was no other reason why this otherwise healthy guy was in my office, because he had a cold for 2 days.
Right. I mean, one of the things that I found in reporting on this series is that a lot of people in their work do kind of mindless work a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. And it's the mindless portion of your job that is most vulnerable to robots. Mm-hmm. But it sounds like a lot of your work, you were telling me that the moment a patient comes in, you're sort of always kind of watching what they say, their body language, how they say it, trying to figure out if they're lying or...
Yeah. And lying is very rare, but usually you're trying to sniff out what is the real question. In this case, the example of the young mm-hmm. man who had you know, the girlfriend who was diagnosed with cancer, that was pretty straightforward. He was willing to share it. People don't always want to share about it. People can be victims of child abuse, domestic abuse, substance abuse, all sorts of things that maybe, surprisingly enough, if I actually ask them a question, they'll tell me, but I have to think to ask that. Or recently I saw a woman who was, you know, grieving the loss of, very tragic loss of her 26-year-old son, and she was complaining about a lot of insomnia, and she was going on, and finally I told her, and I said, you know, if you get some sleep tonight, you know, Jason won't hold it against you. And I had to say that, and she looked at me and said, I needed to hear that just now. The barrier for her getting the sleep was that she was using that insomnia as a means of, it was like a token of her grief and her loss.
If I could interject real quick, I think one underlying fallacy of the whole will robots replace humans is this notion that there's only one right answer. You know, like if you have, you know, these set of issues that'll lead to this diagnosis. I mean, she's pointed out that that's not the case. It's the same with writing. I kind of chuckle every time a journalist asks me, are you going to automate me out of a job? So what you're saying is if one of our robots wrote a perfect story on about a particular event, that means nobody else needs to write anything else about that event. You know, same with science. I think there's no better case than, you know, the situation where E equals MC squared may not be valid. You know, so what if a robot had computed that, and does that mean we should no longer look into that? So science should just stop, no more investigation into that because a robot said it, therefore it's true. So I think, you know, there's a little bit of a fallacy that if a robot can do it, that means humans or anybody else should just stop looking at it. You know?
Well, but it's not a fallacy if you consider that your software could do it at a, you know, fraction of the price that any human can. So maybe we'll have, so that, I mean, that sort of replaces all avenues for humans to write, right? I mean, if the software can do it extremely well as a human can, maybe you'll have 3 different flavors of the software writing 3 different stories. But why would you want a human to do it?
And that may be, I'm just saying where we're at now, you know, I don't think we're in any danger of automating humans out of a job for most of the things we're talking about. That's probably the next sort of step down the path once we've had, you know, several evolutions of all of the technologies we're talking about before that would even be realistic.
But also I'm thinking like in the case of like a biography writer, you know, a biography writer would write a very different story than an autobiography writer. So even if your type of software could empower someone like, okay, in the future everyone will write their own autobiography, it would still be a different story that was told. And look at all the number of biographers that have written so many different stories about, you know, famous people because they take particular aspects of that and look at their life through a different filter.
I think the greater danger, I think, is when these sort of approaches break away from us entirely. For example, say your algorithm starts writing articles only for other computers, for example, right? The similar thing for science is the algorithms could break away and they just start doing science that we can't even understand, we can't keep up with. But they find it useful, they continue on, they break away from us. The real danger here is...
I just want to is that, you think that's a real danger? Explain why that's not science fiction.
So we're getting to this point where we can generate results that we don't immediately understand. We're analyzing things that are more complicated than we can even possibly appreciate, right? And so a famous mathematician who was actually on my committee, Stephen Sorgatz, said that we're actually in a very special time in the whole evolution of mankind and science and technology. Because we're in a special window where we can actually understand the things around us. Most of the science, all the science that's been done in the past 1,000 years, we're fortunate that it's simple enough for us to actually understand and appreciate. But you can see now, especially when we start analyzing social networks and a lot of kind of the cutting edge technology in physics and things like this, the systems are too high dimensional for us to understand or wrap our hands around, that we're fundamentally limited. And if we want to step beyond that, we're going to need these sort of automated approaches, right? And then it gets us into the situation where we find results that we cannot understand. And we fundamentally cannot understand because they're too high dimensional for us.
That's what you mean by break away from us?
Break away from us, yes. That's what I mean by break away from us.
And I don't think that's too far away. I mean, you know, you mentioned Watson. I mean, the thing that was just very interesting to me was last February watching the Watson Jeopardy Challenge where IBM software and hardware, you know, beat two of the best Jeopardy challenge champions at a very humanistic game. I mean, Jeopardy, who 10 years ago would have thought that software could beat Jeopardy champions at a very humanistic game? It's already happened, and it wasn't even close.
Right.
And so that's at a humanistic game that software can beat humans at, much less going beyond that in questions that humans can't even understand, but computers can potentially process and understand.
I mean, I think, talking to you, Michael, and your advisor, Hod Lipson, the kind of the thing you guys struggle with is that the computers will give us the answer, we won't know what it means, and this sort of philosophical question that arises out of there is like whether that's an actual discovery for humans, whether that's actually science.
Mm-hmm.
If the computers understand everything about a certain system, a certain set of data, but the humans don't. And you guys are working on ways to have the computers kind of explain it to the humans, explain what they find to humans. Can you describe that and whether that's possible? Like, are the computers going to get so smart that we're just going to be like very dumb compared to them?
Yes, well, I think it's crucial that we focus a lot of energy and attention on not just the technology to make discoveries, but also the technology to explain discoveries and explain them in a way that we can appreciate and understand. So being able to connect it to our existing knowledge base and being able to say, this is similar to this, but it's much more complicated than you could possibly understand, right? Certain things could be like trying to explain quantum mechanics to your dog or something like that. But we still want to benefit from that. So we need some way of crossing that gap and having these discoveries mapped back to a domain that we can still understand and make sense of. And I think that's kind of the long-term future of science, I think, will be explaining the connections from what we know.
And that's the role that humans would play?
Yeah, I think that's where they'll be focusing on over the next 100 years, most likely.
Does that mean we need Eureka for humans then eventually?
Well, I think there's a long way to go, but we need, this is something that maybe Watson could help out with, right? But it's something that's fundamentally human that they would need to understand us as well as we understand each other, right? In order to put something in a frame of reference that we can understand. So I think that's possible, but I think that's still a ways off. That's kind of an area of AI that's very slow moving at the moment.
Mm-hmm. So Sarah, I was thinking about what you do, and so the reason that I think that part of what you do will be difficult to automate, what we just talked about, is and other jobs like yours, which have this quality of face-to-face interaction and conversation, which computers aren't very good at now. But one of the things that I find about technology is, it's always getting better at a rate that we can't really appreciate, and it's hard for us to predict the future because it's sort of always getting faster, and we don't really understand that. And so, maybe 10 years ago, a travel agent might have been in your position and said, no one is ever going to use a computer to book their trip because there's too many variables, it's too complicated, and I won't, and they'll always need me, and now we don't. Mm-hmm. Can you sort of respond to that argument and think, do you hold it in your head as at least being possible that we might not need doctors like you in 5 years' time?
So let me try to answer this by outrunning my headlights slightly, because this is going to get outside my area of strength. But as you know, in a lot of other areas of very high cognitive specialties, we're starting to see much more like what you could simplify as hive intelligence, right? Certainly in the scientific community, you don't really see a lot of solo scientists. It's very collaborative. And I think when we see scientific innovation in medicine, one of the things that's really hampering is that although the scientific aspects of medicine are very much benefiting from this collaborative sort of hive intelligence, there's a lot of regulatory barriers that prevent us from implementing that. And so then the delivery of medicine, we have two problems. One is the delivery of medicine is still, for a lot of regulatory purposes, has to be done in this very, one-on-one, individualistic style. The other sort of fundamental barrier we have is we're good at aggregating data from clinical trials and from sort of hands-off medicine. So, you could query all the pathologic specimens in your wife's lab, for example, and you could get data from that. We don't have a good way of really querying a lot of clinical practices to really aggregate a lot of data points, and some of that is very, some of that's just kind of hardwired into the culture of medicine, but a lot of it is regulatory. There's a lot of, naturally, if you did an article about, scientists being put out of business or having to fundamentally change the way that they share scientific data, there would be a select group of people that would, in the public, that would care about that and would react to it. If anything hits the newspaper about aggregating patient data and sharing it in a cloud somewhere, it's,
So people's worries about privacy and regulation.
Exactly, in a nutshell, yes,
That'll
exactly. In the near term, that is one of the things that's why it has often been a very late arriver to this, is because we're not able to share data so much, and there's so many barriers to aggregating.
No, that's an interesting point that I touched on in various parts of the series, is that there are laws that humans have designed that protect humans. Pharmacists, in order to dispense medicine, you need to have someone who's an accredited pharmacist in a location for anybody to give out medicine there. Even like the pharmacy tech person who makes minimum wage, and so that's a regulation that's going to protect pharmacists, even if we have technology that might be able to replace pharmacists and give you your medicine from something like a vending machine. You can't really do that because there are laws about that. I wonder if I saw some evidence that might change in pharmacy because the economics of having machines do it are so compelling that maybe the regulations might go away. Do you think that at some point in medicine we may see people may say it's really could be good for patients if we aggregate some of this data?
We're seeing that in an emerging economy, certainly in Africa and in China, these large populated countries where the medical and infrastructure is very skinny. There's a lot more of a compelling argument and significant reductions in regulatory barriers to implementing a lot more telemedicine, and sort of the common practice for delivering a lot of healthcare in African villages is tribal-based, or village-based medicine. It is population-based medicine. That's the model that they're used to. I was talking to a colleague of mine. It's with the University School of Dentistry, and he just kind of during dinner conversation dropped the fact that in China they're going to have this huge problem with dentistry because they essentially do not have the profession of dentistry in mainland China, and it wasn't necessary because they were eating a traditional Asian continent diet, which was not significant risk for dental disease, but they're starting to see this latest affluent generation is starting to get significant. They're starting to develop pediatric dental disease, and they have nothing to deal with it. So that's going to be a very, you're going to have a very, an emerging affluent population that's very comfortable with technology, that is going to have a public health crisis and no really good way to scale. We're not going to be able to train up enough dentists and dental technicians and hygienists to go out everywhere. So there will be some changes like that, but they'll largely be driven, I think, in developing and emerging economies.
So if we don't do it, someone else will.
Someone else will invent the robot dentist.
Yes, exactly.
How are we doing on time? Should we switch to questions? Okay. Great. Who has a question?
This question is for Michael Schmidt, and I'm very curious about two aspects of what you said.
Who are you, please?
I'm sorry, I'm James Barrett. I'm a documentary filmmaker. Two aspects of it. One is the inscrutable nature of evolutionary algorithms. What is it about their input and their how they work and what they output that's difficult to understand? And you could probably use John Koza in that answer. And then the other question is, are you alluding to, when you talk about intelligence or intelligent machines getting out of control, are you referring in any way to the intelligence explosion, referring to I.J. Good?
Yes,
and his
so
work?
In a way, yeah. So let me talk about what evolutionary algorithms are. And the idea is, traditionally AI has been focused on trying to simulate what a human brain would do. It has like a memory center, and then it has this computational unit, and it tries to connect these to sensors. What an evolutionary algorithm does is it just gives a randomness, like a random computer program, random ones and zeros, and it competes them in an evolutionary process so that they start with the population, and you figure out which ones do slightly better than the other ones, and you throw away half, and then you recombine those. And eventually, a solution emerges because you can do this billions and billions and billions of times. Similar to how in natural evolution there's been millions and millions of generations. You can do this in seconds or minutes or hours on a computer and get very, very good results. And that's what a genetic program or an evolutionary algorithm does, is it simulates this process such that an intelligent, complicated solution emerges. We don't have to design it from the top down. It's something that comes from the bottom up. So it's not fundamentally limited by our own understanding. That's the idea. So it can produce things that are beyond our capability, potentially, to understand, things that are too complicated, or problems that we just haven't been able to tackle ourselves efficiently. And there's been a lot of different applications like antenna design, things like this. So that's kind of what an evolutionary algorithm does and why it's difficult for us to understand them, because they're stochastic. They kind of come up with results automatically that emerge. We don't design them from the top down. We provide a simulation such that they come out, they arise. And you mentioned also when I alluded to, I think, what's sometimes called the singularity or the technological explosion, things like this. So I think these are, I don't like to use the term singularity because I think it's a very heavy loaded term, but closely related to that, I think something very, very similar where when I talk about breaking away, this is very closely related to the singularity. Some people might consider that to be a technological explosion. And I think it's a good thing and something we should push for. I'm much more optimistic than others. So we should let another question.
One more question, I think.
Andrew Asklund, College of Law, Arizona State University. I wonder if in a way what we do when we use computers is we perhaps lapse into kind of a probability fetish, that that the programs are good at sort of identifying. I mean, you said the salient features, and so that's what we focus on, and they're good for that. But it might be the case that sometimes what's really interesting is not amongst the probabilities. Right? So it's easy to imagine a program that, for example, writes a story about quarterback Q completing so many passes, so many yards, despite so many interceptions. That could sort of generate over and over again. But the extent something odd takes place in a game that we think is really important, the computer would not notice that. And it seems like data generally could play that way. Something really important doesn't fit into the probability story, and not just is it missed, but we may sort of have a tendency to focus on probabilities and missed the outliers, outlying facts, outlying data.
Do you want to answer that, Rob?
Yeah, so one of the things we focus on are the outliers, because again, for us to compete with the ESPNs and the Yahoo Sportses of the world, we have to create content that's different and compelling. And so doing the same thing, is writing about the same things they are, won't sort of meet that bar. And so the things actually we do focus on are trying to make sure that we look for the outliers, because again, that's what computers are good at. I mean, you say they're focused on kind of the probabilities that are most likely to hit, but they can also be good at looking at things that aren't likely to hit just as easily if you're willing to program them to look for that. And in fact, that's exactly what we do, because that's one of the benefits that you get with software is you for the same amount of cycles that you burn trying to look for the things that are highly probable, you can also look for the things that are unlikely to occur. And again, there's a lot of value in that the typical human can't do, because they can't process all that information.
Okay, I think we're out of time. If you have other questions for these people, they'll be probably around here for a little bit. But thanks so much, and we'll have another panel soon. Right here. I'm Farhad Manju for Slate V. For the last few months, I've been looking into the rise of robotics and artificial intelligence software in American workplaces. As I was analyzing real-life robots in science, medicine, journalism, and the law, one thing that struck me was how different they are from robots that we're used to seeing in movies and on TV. For starters, on screen you usually find robots doing humans' dirty work. Look at WALL-E. He's a waste collection robot. Or remember those butler robots in Woody Allen's Sleeper?
Are you thirsty, Mr. Monroe? Me? No. No, thank you.
Today's robots aren't anywhere close to being able to do the kind of work that robot maids do. Take Rosie from the Jetsons. She can recognize objects, she speaks and understands English.
Come and get it.
She has fine motor skills, she can navigate through a whole apartment. All these skills are very difficult for our real-life robots. Creating machines that can manipulate the physical environment in the way that a human can is one of the most challenging tasks in robotics. And here's the irony. While today's robots aren't very good at doing our dirty work, they're great at doing our mental work. Part of the reason is that computers are getting much better at understanding language. The movies have long suggested that when computers acquire speech, we'll control them just by talking to them. You know, like the computer in Star Trek.
Computers, send a subspace message. Starfleet command. Security channel authorization.
Alpha 47 authorization required to activate security channel.
Modern speech recognition isn't as good as that, although it's quickly improving.
Assieds-toi.
But the real advantage in computers learning language is that they can start to understand documents. Today, legal robots can search through a whole stack of evidence in a complicated trial and discover incriminating emails, for example. And robots can also be creative. There are now machines that can write sports stories. Software can also be funny. Researchers recently created a computer that's sure to amuse fans of The Office. It can recognize when it would be hilarious to say, "That's what she said!" When computers are shown to be funny, the joke is usually that they fail to understand human sensibilities, like Vicky from Small Wonder.
I'm not programmed to smile. Well, then I'll program you to. This is a smile. Got it? Got it.
And computers are rarely shown to be creative. They're almost always portrayed as rigid, single-minded, bent on their pre-programmed mission. There are exceptions, of course. In Star Wars, R2-D2 seems to understand funny when he sees it.
Help! I think I'm melting. This is all your fault.
And then there's Hal from 2001. He certainly reacts creatively when he sees a threat to his mission.
I know that you and Frank were planning to disconnect me. And I'm afraid that's something I cannot allow to happen.
But the most interesting thing about Hal is the work he does. He's identified as a crew member on board the ship, and he takes care of most of the ship's functions. He renders the humans almost irrelevant. In a few years' time, after the robots have taken all our jobs, we may come to see that as a pretty good call.
This conversation can serve no purpose anymore. Goodbye.
Al? Al?
Okay, so our next panelists can come up. So in this panel, I kind of want to talk about what we just ended with, which is whether artificial intelligence is a fundamentally new kind of technology and will affect the economy in a way that that technological improvements that we've had in the past, didn't. Whether it'll sort of actually put us out of jobs or just do what other technology has done, which is spur economic growth and make room for people to get new kinds of jobs. So the person who has argued sort of the more pessimistic view is Martin Ford. He is a technologist, and he's the author of a book called, a great book called The Lights in the Tunnel, which is, argues, I thought very convincingly, that things are going to be very bad. So Martin is from California. He lives in Silicon Valley. He writes software. Is that right? Right. Writes software, and a thing that I found in this series is that people who are on the technology side of it are much more believe much more that robots will come for us than other people, and maybe it's because they understand the technology, or maybe they just have a lot more faith in the computers. And then we have Michael Lind, who is from here, the New America Foundation. He's the policy director for the New America Foundation's Economic Growth Program. From what I can tell, Michael believes a lot of what Martin says, but disagrees with some of the timing, so we can talk about that. And then we have Tyler Cowen, who's an economist that many people have heard of, who know well, and I think that I was hoping that Tyler would tell us that both of these people were completely wrong, but I think he's not going to say that, so we'll see. Because we chatted yesterday, and he seems pessimistic as well, but maybe I'm wrong. Okay, but let's start with you, Martin. Tell me why, we've had 100 years ago, most of the population worked in agriculture. Then we had lots of automation and great technology come about. Now very few people work in agriculture, but the economy wasn't ruined. Why won't that same process work out with AI?
Okay. First of all, let me say that I don't really argue that everything is going to be terrible, but I do think that we're going to have to adapt our economy. I do think that if we're unable to make the necessary adjustments, then things could potentially be quite negative. Historically, what we have found is that technology has advanced, and the economy has always adapted to that. As Farhad said, the example of the mechanization of agriculture is one really good example. You used to have most of the people working in agriculture, and now you've got 2%. And what we found is that in the short run, that did cause significant disruption and unemployment. But over the long run, people moved to other sectors. They moved to manufacturing first, and later they moved to services. But what we found historically is that these technologies, going back perhaps 200 years or so, have been primarily mechanical or perhaps electromechanical. And they've tended to focus in single industries or single employment sectors. And that's certainly what happened with agriculture. But if you look at what's going on today, it's really quite different. We now have this special new field called information technology. And it's really ubiquitous. IT has its tentacles everywhere. I mean, it's going to impact every single industry in existence, and perhaps more importantly, it's going to impact any industry or new sector that arises in the future. And so that really becomes quite different. Now it's much more broad-based. In essence, what you're seeing is that things are becoming much less labor-intensive. As jobs are destroyed in traditional areas now, it's much less likely that a whole new sector is going to rise up that can absorb all those workers in the way, for example, that manufacturing arose when agriculture was mechanized. And the reason is that information technology is going to invade everywhere at once, and it's going to, increasingly form the basis of new industries and new employment sectors that are created in the future. So I think what's happening overall is that, the nature of machines is changing. They're becoming more autonomous. They're moving from being complements to becoming substitutes. That's happening sort of overall on the average, and the whole economy is basically becoming less labor intensive.
Tyler, what do you think of that? I mean, is it fundamentally a new kind of thing?
I do think it's a new kind of thing, but let me outline a more optimistic case, and we can all decide what to make of it, since this is what you want. When smart machines really take off, there will be much, much more output. Things will be more efficient, there'll be more stuff, it will be higher quality, medicine will be much better, so there'll be a lot more wealth. That wealth means it's possible to support many people, so even if wages are low in a lot of sectors, if you own a pretty small amount of capital, you'll still be quite well off. An alternative scenario is that governments own capital to some extent and have more redistribution. There's a kind of guaranteed annual income in this scenario because it's easy enough to afford it. And maybe a lot of people don't have jobs in the contemporary sense, but again, they still do fine. So as long as total output is going up, which clearly it is in these scenarios, there's always optimistic corners to these pictures. The other point I would make is I think smart machines will always be complements and not substitutes, but it will change who they're complementing. So I was very struck by this woman who was the doctor sitting here a moment ago, and I fully believe that her role will not be replaced by machines, but her role didn't sound to me like doctor. It sounded to me like therapist, friend, persuader, motivational coach, placebo effect, all of which are great things. So the more you have these wealthy patients out there, the patients in essence are the people who work with the smart machines and augment their power. Those people will be extremely wealthy. those people will employ in different ways what you might call personal servants. And because those people are so wealthy, those personal servants will also earn a fair amount. So the gains from trade are always there. There's still a law of comparative advantage. I think people who are very good at working with the machines will earn much, much more. And the others of us will need to find different kinds of jobs. But again, if total output goes up, there's always an optimistic scenario.
Doesn't your optimistic scenario require a long transition period? So if this technology was going to come about in over a period of 100 years, maybe we could sort of adjust society to that model. But if it's going to come about in the next 20 years, let's say, wouldn't it be much harder to get there?
We're going to have a long transition scenario. You look at something like chess, which is highly manageable, highly regular. It took really quite a long time to get chess-playing machines to be able to beat the best humans. Go, the best humans are still better. Shogi, it's close. You look at a lot of different areas. There's medicine, there's law, there's economists. And they're going to proceed at different paces. There'll be a kind of slow, gradual turnover of the economy where different sectors get turned into smart machines and people shift sectors. And I don't see why it's the singularity scenario that we wake up one morning and the Terminator arrives and it's like, oh my God. I think that's pretty unlikely.
Michael, what do you think?
Well, I recommend Martin Ford's book. I read it when it came out. It's the best discussion of the subject I've read, and one of its benefits is that he has anticipated all possible objections. And so I was looking at it this morning, and he basically said what I'm going to say. It's one of the many cases, two in particular. First, that he's premature, and second, that related to that in the short run, I think that you will create new labor-intensive jobs, at least in the short run, that will absorb a lot of the people shunted out of productivity.
What kind of labor-intensive jobs?
Well, here's the thing. Historically, rich people have tended to be the pioneers for the next wave of employment. I came across a great quote from Woodrow Wilson around 1900 when he was president of Princeton, saying that nothing excites socialistic feelings more than the sight of an automobile, right? And of course, then you have Henry Ford. Everybody has a car. So if you have this process of Fordism, what is happening as a result of productivity growth? A lot of mechanical tasks are being mechanized or automated. An increasingly number of intellectual tasks are automated. So you would see a growth of personal service jobs that cannot be automated. Well, we have those jobs today. They're jobs of the servants of the rich, right? So if you take a working class person, wins the lottery with the ticket, becomes a billionaire, that person is going to be surrounded by human beings, right? It's going to be surrounded by people doing things that working class people do for themselves or do without. So there are these two categories, things that you would pay other people to do, chores and personal shopping and you name it, or things that you don't even know you have as a desire.
Yeah.
Scented aromatherapy in a 3-day spa, until you actually have the resources for it. So the question is, if the prices are falling, within these amenity services, and at the same time the pool of labor is expanding, historically that's how we've gotten over this.
This sounds like what Tyler's saying, right? I mean,
very similar.
It's the optimistic view.
And so the kinds of jobs that would be there are kinds of jobs like personal shopper, where I would want someone to be my personal shopper. I would want a human to be my personal shopper because it makes me feel good to pay a human to do that rather than a computer. I want a human's taste. Tell me why these are jobs that machines wouldn't do.
Well, part of it is demand. It's simply, my grandfather was an engineer who worked in New York in the 1930s, and he thought that the automat was the wave of the future. This was a restaurant which had the first vending machines. So you should go in, put in, I guess it was a penny, and then the vending machine dropped. And so his vision was by the year 1950, that's how everyone would eat, right? Well, you go to a restaurant now, If it's a moderate income restaurant, you have one person seats you, one person brings, one person explains the specials and so on. So clearly there's, we want to be around other people. You could come up with software to design your own house. But think about it. Right now, only very affluent people can afford architect-designed homes. I think what is more likely that people are going to spend, and also technology is labor-saving.
Yeah.
Are you going to spend the time to master the architecture software? Or would you have, let's say the working class person can afford a working class architect with very good CAD tools. In the long run, I think Martin Ford is absolutely right. That is, eventually, if you get incredibly sophisticated HAL 9000 type, Star Trek computers, you do have to rethink wage labor, which is about 150 years old in the North Atlantic countries and much younger before that. So that could be an interesting question too.
So Martin, what do you think of that suggestion by both?
Well, I think that it's a valid argument, but I have concerns primarily on it's about the concentration of income and the concentration of consumption that we see, and I think the trends, the technology trends are going to probably amplify that. I mean, you're talking about jobs like personal shoppers. I mean, how many people really are there that are going to hire a personal shopper? I mean, you're talking about a very small number.
But I guess they're saying that, if personal shoppers cost a tenth of what they do now, then everyone would get one. I mean, is that right? Is that a good summary?
If I earned $10 million a year, I would hire a person just to take around my dry cleaning.
Right.
But I think basically we'll end up hiring other people to cheer us up. The restaurant example is a very good one. To go to Horn & Hardart is depressing. You go to a restaurant, someone smiles, hello, Mr. Cowan, they bring you to the seat, the waiter, waitress comes by, they cheer you up. A lot of jobs will be about motivation. Just like the doctor here is motivating her patients, motivation will be one of the biggest employment sectors in this future.
I don't know if you guys can tell this, but today, for the first time, so I traveled and I forgot my razor at home. And I went to a barbershop and I got somebody to shave me, which cost me $40.
Well,
and I could have bought a razor for $3.
But by the way,
way,
on this point,
right? I'm paying this person to do a task that I could have done, right?
We always hear that the kids should be studying STEM and mathematics, and
Yeah.
the children are going to be competing with Darwinian algorithms.
Right.
Why do that? Teach your children to be obsequious and friendly. Obsequity is going to be a great virtue.
But I have to say, this optimistic scenario doesn't sound very I mean, it doesn't. I don't want my child to be a personal shopper. Like, can we escape that? I mean, could people do intellectual work?
That's part of it. I'm still doubtful about the numbers. I mean, keep in mind, we've got a workforce in the United States of 150 million people, or at least that many people available to work. I don't believe we're going to take all those working class jobs that are ultimately going to be eliminated by technology and have all those people working for a tiny number of very wealthy people.
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is this only works if you have service sector Fordism, to coin a term. In other words, if you take what are now luxury services and you mass produce them like the spas they offer in the mall, that's a different scenario.
But then that implies...
By Fordism, just let's explain what you mean.
Well, Fordism in the 1920s was the idea that you have mass production but also mass consumption, because the wages rise and the prices fall as a result of technology, and until the automobile worker can afford an automobile. So service sector Fordism, in different societies this may not happen, but it would be a situation where the home health aide can afford the modestly paid personal shopper or the modestly paid caterer.
But the question is going to be, can they afford housing, and can they afford health care, and can they afford energy? That's the bulk of people's budget. So this technology may drive down the price of manufactured goods. It may drive down the price of these kind of personal services. But how are the people who are performing these services for a wage going to earn enough to survive in the real world?
That's a very different argument, because if you're really an optimist about smart machines, they'll make healthcare, education, and real estate much, much cheaper. If your son is a personal shopper, keep in mind, your son's basically an owner of capital. He only needs to work enough to buy some capital and earn this income stream because there's so much output. So to be a personal shopper for 10 hours a week, it's not as bad as it sounds. And I think
for a barber,
doesn't sound very bad.
a lot of people today would trade in for that. And then you have all the people who work with the smart machines and augment their value. And surely not everyone can do that. But it's more than just some tiny elite.
So so go back to this argument about, tell me why it would be 10 hours a week. Because you just have to work for a little bit because everything would be so cheap?
Absolutely. You could work more if you wanted, but...
Oh, but I think I disagree with that. You know, it was the assumption of Keynes and various others that as incomes went up, people would sort of max out and they would translate that into leisure. So essentially we would have decided in 1955 we would be satisfied with Magnavox TVs. And then we would stop working 40 hours a week. My guess is that some of what happens is when, you know, both luxury goods and luxury services become cheap and mass produced, at that point people keep working longer hours to get, you know, like the new genetically designed pet or something that's the big status symbol. I do think
some will, but keep in mind the last 20 years the trend is that only the very wealthy work more and the rest of us work less. So people will decide, but if people want to work less, they'll be able to.
But you're saying because the machines will be doing all this work and making everything cheaper, we'll have everything will be cheap enough that we won't have to work all the time to be.
Again, I'm putting on the optimist hat, which was the request.
Yes.
So.
Okay. Well, I mean, do you actually believe it then? Put on the other hat.
You're going to get a lot of different results, and it will depend a great deal on the country, and most of all how politics responds. One issue I also worry about, distinct from this issue, but I think in some ways very good drugs will be quite a threat to jobs.
Wait, explain that.
If drugs are really fun and totally safe, which may not be possible, we don't know, but you could imagine that as a technological advance, it's really going to cut into a lot of the spending on the personal servants and getting your hair done and going to the spa. Just stay at home and take your drugs, right?
Well, rock stars manage to do all of these things simultaneously.
Sure. So that's a competing force against smart machines, and in part the future will be determined by, you know, which set of forces are winning that race.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe we got a little far off. So Martin, I got this question a lot in comments on my series, which is, why are we assuming that the machines will get really good and the humans will stay behind? You know, a lot of people who think about the future, you know, the singularity, Ray Kurzweil, think about machines making us better. And so why won't that happen?
Well, I think it may, but you know, sort of the starting point for me is the recognition that most of the jobs, most of the work required by the economy has always been on some level fundamentally routine. I think if you go back in history, you know, you had people working the land. That's a very routine job. Later they moved to routine jobs in manufacturing. Today they're more in the service sector. But most people, at all skill levels, they come to work and they face the same kinds of challenges day in and day out, with not exactly the same, but within some narrow range of variation. And those types of tasks and jobs are increasingly going to be exactly what is appropriate for technologies like machine learning, for instance. Now, as we fast forward into the future, you know, if you believe what people like Ray Kurzweil say, we may have, you know, brain implants and such that will make us much smarter, but that doesn't mean that the best way to take on a routine task is going to be to, you know, take a working class person and give them a brain implant to make them smarter. I mean, it's still going to be the case that a specialized machine is going to be best for performing a specialized task. So in order for that kind of vision to result in employment for everyone, you have to imagine an economy that creates, you know, 150 million or more jobs for people to do non-routine creative type tasks. And so that simply hasn't been the case historically. I mean, you know, the people who really get paid to do creative things are relatively small in number, and most other people have always done routine things.
Tyler, so you suggested there were there were multiple different scenarios.
Sure.
What are some of the things we need to get to your optimistic scenario? I mean, sort of regular, you know, in government, in society, education, things like that? I mean,
You need healthcare and education to become sensible and accountability-based sectors, and to some extent deregulated, and they're very far from that. I can imagine a world where basically every child has a tutor. That won't employ everyone, but it will be a large number of jobs. Every old person has 2 people helping him or her out. That will be a large number of jobs. But right now, healthcare and education are total messes in ways which I think are pretty obvious to us all. And that risks the crack-up scenario where those things stay expensive and everything goes wrong.
right. So your scenario wouldn't work if we needed to, if those sectors they got more expensive as they got automated.
But I think the smart machines will do an end run around the regulations, especially in education. Healthcare will be tougher, and it will happen in other countries, and people here will demand it, and they'll basically just get it through the internet. So on that, I'm reasonably optimistic.
Explain what you mean by the machines doing an end run around, like in education. How
Like education, the schools might stay terrible and require a lot of credentialism and certification, but if you can just buy an education box for your kid, at Target, homeschool your kid, sit it by the education box, and have a private tutor come in sometime in the week and pool with other parents, that's going to work, even if there's no real reform in education. So I'm somewhat optimistic there.
Well, I'm a bit more pessimistic on the political side, inasmuch as until the last generation, really a couple of decades ago, you had a third of the human race living under Marxist-Leninist regimes, where the way you had access to the goods of society was to worm your way up in the Communist Party hierarchy. You had much of the rest of the world, Latin America and much of East Asia, was military dictatorships, where the people at the top were not capitalists, they were not technologists. I mean, they were people, they were soldiers. And as long as you have a world of territorial states, which we are going to have, you're going to have different social systems, different social orders. And that was, my point about why you need to take alternatives to the wage system seriously. For most of human history, people did not earn a living by selling their labor in a market. This is about a century, it's less than 2 centuries old, even in Britain and the United States. You had a class of farmers, most of them unfree farmers, slaves or serfs. And then you had a class of parasites, the landlords who happened to be the warlords, to keep the farmers in line and to extract rents from them. So this whole experiment in everyone going out and being able to sell enough of your labor to afford the necessities of your life, it was tried briefly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it was considered such a failure in every industrial country that it was replaced by welfare state systems. Even it didn't matter whether the country was a democracy or a junta or there is no free labor market, no free retirement system, no free market in a number of basic labor-related subsistence goods in any modern technological society. I mean, if you're a libertarian, you can fantasize about what it would be like. But there's not a single territorial state on the planet that does this. So it's already rigged, right? It's been rigged since Bismarck, right? And Franklin Roosevelt and Perón and you name it. So I think that's the question. And just one more point, briefly on this. Why did you have these welfare states and immigration restrictions and minimum wage laws and all of this stuff? It was because the political elites, who were not terribly enlightened necessarily, they feared their people, right? They either feared the people marching on them, overthrowing them, or they needed the people to fight wars, right? And one thing I worry about, it'd be interesting, Martin's thoughts on this, as you move towards an increasingly robotic military, where it's essentially capital intensive, you don't need the peasants anymore. If anything, they're a drag. They don't add to your national strength. And at the same time, it's really difficult for highly dispersed populations, simply to overthrow the government the way it was back when you had one capital city surrounded by a lot of poor people. I just think you have to factor in the political side. You can't just assume this is all going to be solved by the market.
That's
somehow.
the pessimistic scenario.
Yeah. Well, I think it's true that it's hard to be optimistic if you look at the politics of it. ultimately, I think the solution is going to be something that Tyler mentioned earlier, which is a basic guaranteed income. We're going to have to get away from the idea that people have to have a wage-paying job in order to survive. And that's what I advocate in my book. But politically, it's very, very hard to imagine that in terms of what's happening today.
But it's not just politically hard to imagine that. I think it's socially difficult to imagine that. I mean, a lot of people find meaning of their life through work. A lot of people kind of think about their work as being their life's goal.
That's right. And the idea that I've advocated is that we should take a basic income and then we should modify it with certain incentives, most important of which would be education. Just as an example, suppose we paid everyone some minimal basic income, but if you graduate from high school or pass your equivalency test, then you actually get a somewhat higher income. Imagine what that would do for the high school graduation rate. And so we could build some basic incentives, some of which might occupy people's time and give them some purpose into that sort of a scheme. But a basic income, I know it sounds very radical. Probably a lot of people see it as a very leftist welfare state run amok type thing, but actually it's very much a free market idea. Friedrich Hayek supported a basic income. Milton Friedman supported a negative income tax. Which
and Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson opposed it. Because the whole basis of the welfare state liberalism in the United States is that a job is a right, for whatever reason in that historical period. Work was central to your identity as a citizen. So Johnson and Roosevelt hated paying people who weren't working. They wanted public works.
Right, but they did pay farmers for not planting, right? And it's not.
Well, that was different. That's a macroeconomic.
It's not that much of a stretch to me. They're somewhat similar. But I think in the future we may have to, evolve in that direction. But there simply aren't going to be enough paying jobs out there for a lot of people, and even to the extent that if your theory is correct, that there are going to be all these personal service jobs, you can see right away that there's going to be a structural mismatch. And we already have a problem that we can't employ working class men, and women are doing better. And if you're talking about personal shoppers and this type of thing, you're going to skew things even more in that direction, I think.
Tyler, you mentioned the guaranteed wage. What do you think of that idea?
It can't be afforded now, but parts of Western Europe already have something not so far from it. And it would enable us to get rid of a lot of other bad government policies. So I think if we can find a way to get there, it's a better outcome than just piling more in different parts of the welfare state on top of each other. So I don't think it's so unrealistic. It is for 2011. And I think it would be a mistake to have it now. But if you're thinking about 70 years from now, I more or less expect it.
Well, we have it now in the sense that tax expenditures like the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, these are really wage subsidies, going to working people. So already you have part of your income is your actual market wage, and then part of it is this government subsidy. So you could actually get to something like Martin describes by gradually shifting the ratio.
What about this other problem that Martin talks about, which is if we do move to an economy where the job that humans do is this personal service work, there may be a lot of people, maybe men, maybe other people, maybe people with bad taste, people who just don't have the aptitude for that kind of work. What do those people do?
I think this
drugs,
but the new order, you can already see this, will favor conscientiousness as a personality trait. And on average, that will favor female labor, I think. I think there will be some decent percentage of people who, not quite for economic reasons, but for reasons of temperament, are simply going to do very badly in this order. And I think some of those people will end up living in a kind of shantytown, getting a very low income.
With other people who have
with other people like that.
Yeah.
And today we call those prisons, or you have tent cities, or in developing countries, a place like Brazil, you just have people living in low-rent areas and not getting good public services. And I think that will be part of the new equilibrium for some people. People basically who are not conscientious enough to simply take a job. There's a rich person willing to pay them. What they're supposed to do isn't that hard, the wage isn't bad, but they just can't do it. And those people, in my view, will be the big losers.
Do you think Michael's right when he says that the things we should teach our kids is be obsequious?
Be diligent and obsequious.
Yeah.
An alternative option for these equilibria is that people have a lot more kids. So there'll be a pretty cheap supply of very high quality labor, people who can look after your kids, and you can monitor their quality and reliability much better than you can now. So I think in a world of smart machines, it could be that the norm is to have 5 to 7 children again, not necessarily through traditional birth. People will get a lot more pleasure from children. Not everyone, but I think you'll see a lot more people doing this. You already see this among a lot of billionaires or very wealthy millionaires, that they have a lot more kids. It's a new trend. You see it in the numbers. It's now a small number of people. But when you get bored with a lot of other stuff, you reach a certain age, technology gives you greater flexibility. It's like, why not have 6 kids?
And overpopulation won't be a problem because the machines will take care of things?
Well, I didn't say it won't be a problem, right? There'd be an environmental issue that probably will be a problem. But it's a way of thinking about where the jobs will come from. If everyone has 6 kids and they all need nannies, smart nannies, reliable, conscientious nannies, it's an awful lot of jobs.
Well, the point I'd like to make is, and we were sort of joking about obsequiousness and diligence and all of that, but with every shift in the majority of the workforce from one sector to the next, the workers in the previous sector despised the emerging sector as beneath the dignity of an ordinary American, at least, speaking the Anglo-American tradition. So when you first had factories in Massachusetts and in New England, they could only get farm girls to do it because it was unmanly to work in a factory job. Now, you think of the factory job as being like the He-Man sort of thing, but that was for women. Real men were farmers. Well, and so then it took this whole cultural thing where you could actually work in a factory and take orders from a foreman without knifing him to death, you know, and all of this. And so then you had office work, right? But that was wimpy. Right? I mean, the blue-collar worker, you know, was much tougher than Ward Cleaver going to the office in the 1950s. So I do think that there is, you call it feminization or you know, whatever, but there is this trend to get away from the self-reliant male yeoman who's completely self-sufficient. And it's just, it's a cultural shock for men in particular, I think, and breadwinners and so on. But that's nothing new. I mean, that's been going on through the Industrial Revolution. I mean, it's a long-term trend.
Well, one thing I'd add, though, is that I feel the discussion right now is taking on kind of a working-class flavor. You know, what are we going to do with these working-class people? But we need to remember that part of what we've been talking about here is that all this stuff is going to impact what I would call the upper middle class, the educated middle class. I mean, we're going to see these technologies unfold and begin to really undermine a lot of skilled professions. I mean, we've talked about doctors and lawyers, but I think the people that are likely to be hit the hardest are going to be the corporate drone type people, the people that sit in a cubicle inside an organization and they don't really have any of the protections that doctors and lawyers have. So as that kind of unfolds, to me, it's going to ultimately raise a question of what do we do with these more skilled people that are on or should be on the path to success? What do we do with new college graduates? What do we do with people who are in their 40s and 50s and are perhaps impacted by these trends, you know, in the middle of their careers? I mean, in the first panel, you heard them talking about sports writing and how it could automate this and all that. To me, what jumps out is that a lot of entry-level positions are really going to be heavily impacted because those are the more routine jobs. And so how are we going to get the next generation sort of on the path to success?
Well, should we weep, though, for the mid-career lawyers who are going to be replaced by legal software? I mean, this is a fairly elite group. You know, if you go, again, back to the 19th century, you had these very highly paid Welsh ironmongers had to be imported from Wales, you know, for the early iron factories. And then you had the Bessemer steel process, and then unskilled people could do it. I think you're right, you know, and you may have written about this, too. You know, a lot of this, the professions, a lot of human capital, going to be replaced by digital capital and software. The number of people who are affected is fairly small, and they're overpaid, frankly, right now. And society gains so much from this. It just doesn't seem to me to be a big
Well, if you
big
just
problem.
looking at lawyers, then
And
it's fairly
doctors
small.
too,
But if it's
and professors.
if you
But don't just focus on labor income. Think about capital income. Anyone who inherits anything from their parents, which admittedly is not everyone, but they can just live off the capital their whole life. Labor is 68% of GDP. If you imagine all that labor, all those jobs going away, every single one, and we have more output, you just have these staggeringly high returns to capital.
Unless you have 8 kids.
Even then, divide by 8, people will still be doing pretty well. So having access to capital income, I think, is the main question, not what your job will be.
Martin, so I'm starting to be won over by their argument about kind of the future of personal shoppers. Like,
and nannies.
And nannies. I mean, especially, this is sort of the admittedly the most optimistic view. But I guess I wonder, do you think that it's impossible? Do you think that that kind of thing could happen? Are you wavering?
I'm not wavering. I don't, I think one thing we need to consider is the impact of all this on consumption. As jobs begin to erode, as income becomes more and more concentrated, consumption also becomes more concentrated. Right now we see the top 5% of the population in terms of income doing over 35% of the consumption. Now, the trends that we're talking about here are going to impact even that top 5%. I mean, a lot of these highly skilled jobs that pay higher wages are going to be impacted. All of the people that make up the bottom 95% are going to even more heavily be impacted. It's hard to see how you maintain consumption going forward as this unfolds.
Well, it seems to me there's a possible contradiction in what you're saying, because on the one hand, your argument is based on productivity growth. On the other hand, when you're talking about consumption, assuming we're having this rapid productivity growth right now, we had rapid productivity growth in the Depression, and I think you're quite right about that. But that means even with stagnant wages, your purchasing power increases as some of these other goods become cheaper and cheaper, right?
In terms of some manufactured goods, that's true. But again, in terms of if you look at the budget that the average person faces, productivity increases don't necessarily make land cheaper, right? They don't make housing costs cheaper, at least not in the shorter run.
Well,
plenty of land.
Yeah. It depends on where you live. Elizabeth Warren, in her book on the middle class, is something absolutely fascinating. Basically, people pay much more now for real estate than their parents did in order to be in good neighborhoods with good public schools, right? And the reason they're in the good public schools is because it's pre-college.
Right.
And the reason you want to go to college is you want to get the skill-intensive, not-yet automated professional degree. I wonder if you don't have all this unravel, if you no longer want your kid to grow up to be a professional, then there's this kind of falling dominoes. Then you don't need to
buy your education box.
Buy the education box. Yeah, that's right. You don't have to be in that suburban neighborhood, and so on.
Well,
I ask you because you mentioned education. Right now, most people, having taught at various universities, they want jobs. That's their goal. They're not doing this out of pleasure and learning. If you don't need that in terms of the job, then why would people spend more money on education?
Well, I think that as this unfolds, though, you've got a lot of people right now that are living in homes. They've got mortgages. As unemployment increases, we're going to see more defaults. I mean, it's going to impact the entire financial system.
I think you guys are fundamentally disagreeing about kind of the time horizon here. I mean, Tyler said earlier that he thinks it's going to take, not going to happen tomorrow. It's going to take more time. Under your scenario, you're talking about people right now. It sounds like you think that this is going to happen a lot faster than they do.
Well, I think it's already having an impact. I mean, if you look at the last 20, 30 years, what we've seen is that wages have been completely stagnant. Productivity has obviously increased, but the fruits of that productivity increase has really gone to a tiny number of people at the top. I mean, it hasn't been broadly distributed at all. And yet at the same time, we continue to see housing costs, healthcare costs rising. In the shorter run, what I see is unemployment increasing, perhaps gradually, across the board at both skilled and lesser skilled professions. Whereas the longer run impacts in terms of really bringing down healthcare costs or really bringing down housing costs are I think, further out there. So I think we're going to get into a situation where unemployment and stagnant wages and increasing concentration of income and consumption are going to occur over the next 10 years. But I'm kind of doubtful that you're going to see a dramatic reduction in healthcare costs, for instance, over the next 10 years.
Okay, we are at time for questions. Do we have some questions?
Hi, my name is Hamoon Ashragi. I just wanted to ask what you guys thought that all of this, I didn't hear anything about social mobility, but I think that that plays a really important role in at least America's rise and America's story. And, you know, for someone who might be aspiring to be a medical student, would you say now that maybe a $200,000 investment in their education is a bad expenditure, that they should just save that and you know, try to use their inheritance to become part of, I don't know, the capitalist class?
Yeah, what do you, I mean, we hear more and more about people who spend a lot on law school not getting good jobs. Is it a good idea to spend money on that kind of education?
Lower returns for lawyers are great, I think. They need to be much lower yet. In your case with medical school, I suspect the cartel will protect you long enough. So I would say go for it.
Yeah, I think if you look at where we have cancerous cost inflation in this country, it's in two areas where you still have a guild craft-like organization of production. It's law and medicine and maybe even the professoriate with this kind of the tenured professors and the, you know, the lecturers. Someone is going to figure out, whether it's done by government regulation or by the private sector, you're going to have the Henry Ford of higher education and medicine and law. And the prices will drop. And actually, the wages may rise at the bottom. I mean, the nurses may get raises and the lecturers may be paid more, even as the professor's pay goes down. So you know, in that sense, to invest in the medieval education for the skills of the craft that is about to be annihilated, I would think twice about that.
Okay, one more question.
Yeah, charge and persist a minute. I would like to know what would be the economic system. What would be the wage for the robber and who would possess those wage?
What would be the economic system, you said?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess we don't
Can
have
we
an
talk
answer,
to that?
but
Well, what I've advocated is that we're still going to have a free market economy, but then we'll adapt that with some sort of a basic income to provide support for people. If we don't do that, I think there's a risk that we could, at some point in the future, you know, decide that socialism is the only thing that works. I mean, if capitalism really fails.
Well, I think if you, as I was saying earlier about politics, the Roman Emperor Septimus Severus gave his dying advice was keep the soldiers happy. At the end of the day, as long as you have territorial states and they depend on the police and the military, who tend to come from, you know, undistinguished backgrounds, you're going to have some rigged system by which at least some of the gains from growth, even in a robotic economy, are going to ordinary people.
We'll have a meritocracy of IU and conscientiousness, for better or worse.
okay. All right. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, guys.
When we as people decide whether we want to get on immediately or wait, we have to look at the people in the elevator and try and understand their intention, try and understand whether they want to get off or whether they want to stay. And that understanding of the other people's intention is what is critical for making socially interactive robots work. They have to not only know what they want to do themselves, but they have to perceive the people around them and try and understand what those people are trying to do. And people don't have signs on them that says, I'm getting off on floor 3, I'm getting off on floor 4. The robots have to look and try and understand cues, such as gaze. So when the elevator opens, people who aren't getting off tend to look down. People who are getting off tend to look up, want to make sure it's the right floor. Some of them, you know, they start moving. You have to detect them moving forward versus just rocking back and forth. And those types of simple cues are things that are very difficult for robots to do. So we pick up those cues very, very quickly because we've been trained from birth to pick up these social cues. But robots have to be programmed to understand those cues, and it turns out to be a very difficult thing for them to understand what those cues are.
So what techniques is CMU doing to enable robots to act in a socially acceptable way?
So we're looking at basically two different types of social interaction. One is what I call conversational interaction, which is basically what we're doing right now. So while I'm talking to you, you're looking at me, and you're nodding at me to indicate that you understand what I'm talking about. And if you were to start looking off over to the side there, I would know that I had lost you, and I need to say something in order to get you back into the conversation. So that's kind of conversational interaction. And Hala is an example of a conversationally social interactive robot. So it uses gaze to try and bring people in, to engage them. It watches them as they type on the keyboard, and it knows enough about how conversations run to respond appropriately. If someone says hello, the robot will say hello. If someone says salam, the robot will say salam. So it does the appropriate thing in the right context. The other aspect that we're looking at is what I call navigational interaction, and that is...
I'm Joel Garrow. I'm a co-director of this initiative. Future Tense is a partnership among the New America Foundation, Slate Magazine, and Arizona State University. Our goal is to look at not just at emerging technologies, but to ask what do they mean for our culture, values, and society, and what it means to be human.
Did you know that Bakio is the on-campus restaurant? هل كنت تعرف أن عاصمة أوزبكستان هي طشقان الجامعة؟
Hello, Hala.
Welcome to Carnegie Mellon University in Qatar. Feel free to talk with me in English or Arabic. What's your native language? How can I help you? English is an important language. I am a roboceptionist.
What do you do?
I'm a bilingual roboceptionist. I should be able to answer Carnegie Mellon-related questions in Arabic and in English. Try me.
Which is how we end up with this question about our killer robots, job killer robots.
To get to 1004, you need to take the entrance to your left, then turn left again, walk straight and take the second corridor to your right. It should be one of the offices inside.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
How old are you? Is how robots can navigate through space in a socially interactive way. So the getting on and off elevators in a socially interactive way, passing in corridors. So when people are coming towards each other in a corridor, one person moves to the right, the other person moves to the right, and they pass without really having to think very hard about how to do that. And that's a social rule. In fact, it's not only a social rule, it's a cultural rule. So in places like England and Japan where they drive on the left-hand side, they don't pass on the right, they pass on the left. And so if you were to go to England and not understand that, then you would start bumping into people. So you have to know what the social rule is in order to work well in the society.
Okay, so how do you see the international efforts in the area of social interactive robots, and where do you see the Qatar fits in?
So when we started this work, we were focused on social interaction, and the idea was that there were these kind of universal social rules that people obeyed, and it turns out that that was simplistic, that it actually is not only social rules but cultural rules as well. So the way that people interact in different parts of the world differ somewhat according to the culture. So a Middle Eastern culture has somewhat different social rules than a Western culture. And so what we're looking at in Qatar, especially with Hala, is to try and understand those cultural differences and be able to develop a system that can be social and culturally appropriate in Qatar, and at the same time, if you were to take it to the United States, it would be socially and culturally appropriate in the United States by changing a few variables, a few parameters. Right now what we're doing is just trying to explore the various ways that these robots can differ. But one example in navigational interaction is that there is this idea of personal space, how close people will come to one another when they're talking. And in different cultures, the personal space is larger or smaller. And we can characterize that. We can say, okay, if you're in Mediterranean culture, personal space is much smaller, and we can tell the robot this is the size of the personal space when you're in.
A robo-lady never reveals her throw age. Let's just say I'm not the newest model on the block.
أنا بخير. استطيع التحدث بالعربية والإنجليزية.
Have a good day. And remember, the next time your computer doesn't work, don't hit it. We have feelings too.
Dr. Reed Simons, thank you so much for taking the time for this interview. And first, we'd like to know from you, how can we call a robot socially interactive, and how is it different from any other robot?
So most robots, when they operate, they only take themselves into account, their own safety, their achievement of their own goals, so how fast to get to a particular location, how easily it takes to do something. But in social interactions, you take other people into account as well. So you have to understand what they're trying to do and what you can do to help both of you do something smoothly. So like when you're getting onto an elevator, if you barge into the elevator, when people are trying to get out, you block the elevator and no one can move. So the people who are getting on wait till the people get off, and then they can get on. And by doing so, by understanding that there is someone else who's trying to achieve a goal, to try and do something, then you can get both people acting very smoothly, and they won't interfere with each other. So that's kind of the basis of social interaction. And socially interactive robots are robots that not only take their own goals into account, but also the goals of people around them.
So how does a social interactive robot really work?
So basically, the main difference is that what I said, that they have to understand what the people around them are trying to do and act accordingly. So one of the things I like to say is that most of us think that the social rule for getting on and off onto elevators is that you wait for everyone to get off the elevator before you get on. But that's actually not the correct rule. The correct rule is that you wait for everyone who intends to get off the elevator before you get on. Because some of the people aren't going to get off. They're just waiting to go to another floor. And so when we, as people, and the elevator open, Italy, for example, versus the United States, where it's much larger, and then the robot can behave like an Italian or like an American.
So what do we mean when we speak about the gap between the robotic behavior and the social interaction? What do we mean by this gap?
So again, the basic gap is understanding other people. It's this idea that the robot is not operating in isolation, but it's operating in a peopled environment, and it has to understand not only what it is trying to do, but what the people around it are trying to do, and to behave in ways that facilitate not only its own actions, its own goals, but the goals that of the other people. So when people are typically when you talk about people being antisocial, you say, oh, he's very rude, he's very antisocial. What they typically mean is that this person only thinks about himself and doesn't think about anyone else. And that's the same thing for the robots. The robots, if they behave only thinking about themselves, then they tend to look antisocial. And when they start considering other people, then they look more social. So the main thing that we have to look at is how we can get them to understand that there are people around and what those people are interested in doing, whether they want to have a conversation with the robot, or be left alone, or be escorted somewhere, or that they have certain other needs. All those things need to be understood by the robot in order to be looked at as social.
So what future uses can socially interactive robots be used in?
So my personal philosophy is that social interaction can be applied anywhere that we have technology. So not just robots. So you might think of the robot receptionist is a very good example. Service robots. So a robot that is coming in to, let's say, clean floors. It needs to know that there are other people around there. Maybe it shouldn't come into this room because there are people working. It goes some other room first and then comes back to this room later so it doesn't disturb the people. Maybe when it comes in, it asks